The day I learned someone was trying to lease my roof to the sky itself started with a fluorescent orange notice taped to my front door and a woman screaming about airspace from the sidewalk. I hadn't even finished my coffee when an HOA Karen informed me, loudly and incorrectly, that my house was now a revenue-generating aviation asset. She smiled while saying it, like this was a favor, like I should be thanking her for monetizing my shingles. That was the moment I realized my quiet home had somehow been promoted to a landing zone without my consent. I live at the edge of a planned community that pretends it's upscale because it has a decorative fountain and a laminated rulebook thicker than my mortgage documents. My house predates the HOA by decades, which has always irritated them, but we've coexisted in that tense, passive-aggressive way where they send letters and I frame them for fun. That morning, though, the orange notice wasn't a violation warning. It was a lease summary. My name was typed on it. My address was correct. The signature at the bottom was not mine. I stepped outside holding the paper, and that's when I saw her. Karen stood near the curb in a reflective vest, clipboard hugged to her chest, chin lifted toward my roof like she was inspecting a skyscraper. She didn't say hello. She pointed upward and announced that the HOA had entered a provisional agreement to lease rooftop clearance space for drone corridor access. She said it the way people say weather forecasts, as if it were already done and resistance would just be inconvenient. I laughed, which apparently offended her deeply. She snapped that this wasn't a joke and that unmanned aerial logistics were the future, whether I liked it or not. I asked her who exactly she thought owned my roof. She said the HOA had jurisdiction over community harmony, and that included vertical utilization. She actually used those words, vertical utilization, and waited for them to land. I told her to get off my property. She adjusted her vest, scribbled something, and informed me that refusal would be noted. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said the Aviation Authority had already been notified of the designated rooftop access point. That was new. And very wrong. Over the next hour, I learned just how far this had gone. The HOA president, who lived 3 streets over and had never once spoken to me directly, had decided the community was missing out on revenue from emerging air traffic. Delivery drones, survey flyovers, emergency routing, all of it. They needed elevated reference points, flat roof, clear lines. My house, according to them, was perfectly positioned. Never mind that I wasn't a member of the HOA. Never mind that they had no claim to my property. Karen had taken it upon herself to manage the rollout. She started knocking on neighbors' doors, explaining that my roof would be used temporarily, that there would be minimal disruption, and that everyone would benefit. I watched from my porch as people nodded slowly, the way you do when someone is confident enough that you assume they must be right. One guy even gave her a thumbs up. I called the HOA office and was told I'd need to submit a formal objection in writing. I asked them how they'd managed to draft a lease without my consent. They said it was a standard provisional agreement, subject to final approval. I asked who signed it. They said the Architectural Review Committee chair had authority. I reminded them I wasn't under their authority. The woman on the phone paused, then said she'd escalate it. That was when the first drone flew over my house. It wasn't large, but it was low enough that I could hear it, a mechanical buzz cutting through the morning like an insect with a purpose. It hovered briefly above my roof, dipped, then moved on. Karen clapped once, sharply, and wrote something on her clipboard. She looked at me like I'd just witnessed progress. I didn't wait. I went inside, pulled up the public records, and started digging. Aviation rules are not suggestions. Airspace classifications exist for a reason. Unapproved structures, even implied ones, can trigger investigations, especially when someone claims operational control they don't have. I found the contact number for the Regional Aviation Authority and called it, expecting voicemail. Instead, a man answered. Calm voice. Professional. I explained that an HOA was attempting to lease my roof as part of an aerial corridor. There was a long silence. Then he asked me to repeat that, slowly. By the time I finished, he told me to email everything I had. Photos, notices, names. He asked if any test flights had occurred. I told him about the drone. He exhaled, and I could hear something shift on his end, like a chair rolling back. He said someone would be looking into it immediately. I went back outside just as Karen was placing a small temporary marker near my driveway. She said it was for survey alignment. I asked her if she'd spoken to the Aviation Authority that morning. She said they were fully aware. She said they were excited. Her confidence was absolute, and for a brief moment I almost admired it. Then a white SUV pulled up. No lights, no sirens. Just official insignia on the door and two people stepping out with folders already open. They didn't look at Karen first. They looked at my house, then at the roof, then at the marker. One of them asked who was responsible for the claimed rooftop operations. Karen raised her hand like a student eager to answer. I watched her expression change as they introduced themselves. The vest didn't help her now. She launched into her explanation, full of buzzwords and optimism, and they let her talk. They always do. When she finished, one of them asked for the signed authorization from the property owner. She turned and looked at me. I smiled and held up the orange notice. The man took it, read it once, then again, slower. He asked Karen who advised her that an HOA could lease vertical access over private property without consent. She said it was implied. He wrote something down. Then he asked if any unmanned flights had already occurred. She hesitated. I pointed upward. The air felt heavier after that. They told her to stop all activity immediately. They told her to remove the marker. They told her there would be follow-up. Karen's voice dropped an octave as she asked what kind of follow-up. The woman from the SUV told her it depended on how many regulations had been violated and how quickly. As they left, one of them handed me a card and told me to call if anything else happened. Karen stood on the sidewalk staring at my roof like it had betrayed her. She didn't say anything as she walked away, but her grip on the clipboard was tight enough to bend it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind my house, I knew this wasn't over. People like her don't retreat. They regroup. And now that the sky itself had entered the argument, I had a feeling the HOA was about to learn that some spaces are not theirs to rent. By the next morning, the orange notice was gone, but the tension hadn't left with it. It lingered in the air like static, the kind that makes your skin prickle before a storm. I stepped outside and immediately noticed two things. First, my roof was exactly the same as it had always been, quiet and unremarkable. Second, three of my neighbors were standing across the street, pretending not to stare at it. Karen wasn't among them, which should have been reassuring, but instead it felt ominous. When someone like her goes silent, it usually means she's convinced herself she's right and is just looking for a better angle to prove it. I waved at the neighbors. One waved back. Another looked down at his phone like it had suddenly become fascinating. The third gave me a tight smile that said he knew more than he was comfortable admitting. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that meant. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a notification from the county records system I'd signed up for years ago out of boredom and mild paranoia. A new filing had been submitted referencing my address. I opened it, expecting maybe another complaint or some half-baked zoning inquiry. Instead, I saw an application for a temporary aviation easement. It wasn't approved. It wasn't even complete. But it existed. And the applicant name made my jaw tighten. The HOA. I read it 3 times to be sure. They were claiming a need for temporary aerial access clearance for community infrastructure assessment. No mention of drones delivering packages. No mention of leasing. Just vague, bureaucratic language designed to sound harmless. It was clever in the way only people who don't actually understand the law can be clever, like rearranging words might change reality. I called the number on the Aviation Authority card again. This time, I got voicemail, but it felt different knowing they already had context. I left a message, calm but detailed, and attached screenshots of the new filing. Then I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I drove over to the HOA office. The building sat next to the fountain that everyone loved taking photos of, all glass and fake stone, like it was trying to project transparency while hiding behind policy. Inside, the receptionist recognized me immediately. She gave me the same polite smile you give someone who's already been discussed in a meeting. I asked to speak to the HOA president. She said he was unavailable. I asked about the aviation easement filing. She said she couldn't comment on ongoing initiatives. I asked who had authorized it. She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without answering it. That's when Karen appeared from a side hallway, no vest this time, just business casual and that familiar expression of controlled triumph. She greeted me like we were colleagues, like yesterday hadn't happened at all. She said the HOA was simply exploring options, and that I didn't need to be so hostile. She said the community was excited. I told her the Aviation Authority had already told her to stop. She smiled and said they had suggested revisions, not cancellation. That was a lie, and we both knew it, but she said it smoothly enough that anyone listening might believe her. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice, telling me I was overreacting to a temporary measure that could benefit everyone. I asked her why my name was on the filing. She said it was standard to list affected properties. I asked why it was listed under consent. She said that was a clerical assumption and could be updated later. The way she said later made my teeth grind. I left before I said something that would make things worse. On the drive home, I noticed a small quadcopter hovering near the edge of the neighborhood, higher this time, far enough away to be deniable. It didn't come near my house, but it didn't have to. The message was clear. She wasn't backing down. That afternoon, the Aviation Authority called me back. The calm voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. He said they'd seen the filing. He said it raised concerns. He asked if anyone from the HOA had contacted me directly since the previous day. I told him about Karen. He sighed and said they were escalating the matter internally. He also said something that stuck with me. He said that unauthorized claims over airspace, even implied ones, could trigger serious consequences if flights occurred under false pretenses, especially if someone was representing themselves as having control they didn't possess. He told me to document everything and not to engage further if possible. Of course, that was exactly when Karen decided to engage everyone else. By evening, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Screenshots of messages flew back and forth, half of them clearly written by Karen herself, explaining that a misunderstanding with a single homeowner was delaying a lucrative opportunity. She never named me, but she didn't have to. People asked questions. She answered them confidently. She said the Aviation Authority was on board. She said the drones were safe. She said this was progress. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I posted a single sentence saying that no one had permission to use my property or roof for any purpose, aerial or otherwise. The reactions were immediate. Some people supported me. Others accused me of being selfish. One person asked why I hated technology. Karen replied last. She said she hoped I would reconsider for the good of the community. That night, I stood in my backyard looking up at the dark sky, listening for a buzz that didn't come. I knew she was counting on momentum, on confusion, on the idea that if she acted like it was already decided, it would eventually become true. What she didn't seem to understand was that the sky is one of the most regulated spaces on Earth, and pretending to own a piece of it is a fast way to get noticed by people who do not appreciate imagination. Somewhere above my roof, invisible lines existed that she had just stepped across. And unlike HOA rules, those lines came with consequences. The first official letter arrived 2 days later, slid into my mailbox with enough authority that I could feel it before I touched it. Thick paper, formal envelope, return address stamped in a way that suggested this wasn't a warning but a record. It wasn't from the HOA. That alone made my pulse slow in a very specific, satisfied way. It was from the Regional Aviation Office, and it informed me that my property had been flagged in connection with an unauthorized airspace representation inquiry. Flag sounds ominous until you realize it cuts both ways. The letter explained that a third party had submitted documentation implying operational control over Rooftop and immediate vertical clearance associated with my address. It requested confirmation, in writing, that I had not granted such authority. It also advised me, politely but firmly, to report any further aerial activity originating from or targeting my structure. The final paragraph made it clear that false claims of control could expose the submitting party to civil penalties and regulatory enforcement. I signed the confirmation and sent it back within 10 minutes. That afternoon, Karen showed up again. This time she didn't bring a clipboard or a vest. She brought paperwork, a stack of it, thick enough that she had to brace it against her hip as she walked up my driveway like she belonged there. She didn't knock. She rang the bell twice, fast, the way people do when they want to establish urgency. When I opened the door, she launched straight into it. She said the HOA was moving forward with a revised proposal. She said legal had reviewed the situation. She said the Aviation Authority correspondence was routine and nothing to be alarmed about. She held up the papers like proof, flipping through them just fast enough that I couldn't read anything. I asked her to step off my property. She smiled tightly and said she just needed a minute. She said the community was growing impatient. She said delays could cost everyone. She said my refusal was becoming an issue. I asked her if she understood what an unauthorized airspace representation inquiry meant. She blinked just once, then said it meant paperwork. She said paperwork was normal. She said she dealt with paperwork all the time. I told her the Aviation Authority didn't send letters for fun. That was when her tone changed. The confidence didn't disappear, but it hardened, like she'd decided friendliness was no longer efficient. She said the HOA had contingency plans. She said zoning and safety concerns could be revisited. She said she'd hate for inspections to suddenly become necessary. She said it in a way that was clearly meant to sound casual. I laughed again, because at this point it was either that or scream. I told her that threatening inspections over a fictional lease was a bold strategy. I told her she should probably stop talking and consult whoever she thought legal was. She snapped that she was authorized to speak on behalf of the board. I closed the door. Through the window, I watched her stand there for a moment, papers clutched too tightly, jaw working as if she was rehearsing what she'd say next. Then she turned and walked back to the sidewalk, phone already at her ear. That evening, the sky buzzed. It wasn't directly over my house, not at first. It was higher, farther out, a distant mechanical hum that drifted in and out like a mosquito you can't quite see. I stepped outside and scanned the horizon. Near the edge of the neighborhood, above the rooftops closer to the HOA core, a drone hovered steadily, lights blinking. It stayed there for a long time. I called the number on the card again. This time, I didn't get voicemail. The same calm voice answered, and when I described what I was seeing, the calm sharpened. He asked for the time, the approximate altitude, the direction. He asked if it appeared to be conducting any survey maneuvers. I told him it was holding position. He thanked me and told me to stay put. 10 minutes later, the drone moved. It drifted slightly, then descended, disappearing behind houses that weren't mine. The sky went quiet again, but my phone buzzed almost immediately with a message from the neighborhood group chat. Karen had posted an update saying that preliminary assessments were underway and that residents should not be alarmed by temporary aerial activity. I took screenshots. The next morning, 2 vehicles pulled into the HOA office parking lot that didn't belong to anyone who lived there. Plain, unremarkable, the kind that blend in until you know what to look for. By midday, rumors started circulating. Someone said the HOA president was in a closed-door meeting. Someone else said the fountain was turned off because maintenance had been suspended. Karen stopped posting. That afternoon, I received another call. This one wasn't just informational. The Aviation Authority representative told me that the drone activity had been traced to a contractor operating under the assumption of valid authorization. He said that assumption was incorrect. He said the matter was now formally under review. He also said something else, quieter this time. He said that when people fabricate control over regulated spaces, they tend to underestimate how quickly those claims unravel once flights occur. He said documentation has weight, and so does timing. As the sun set, I sat on my porch watching the sky fade from blue to orange to gray. Somewhere in that fading light, Karen's version of reality was starting to collapse. She'd tried to lease something she didn't own, convinced herself that confidence could replace consent, and now the very authority she'd name-dropped to intimidate me was paying attention. And they were not amused. The HOA went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like a room full of people holding their breath at the same time. No emails. No flyers taped to mailboxes. No updates in the group chat. Even the fountain was turned off, its usual artificial cheer replaced by the hollow sound of wind moving through the concrete basin. When an HOA that loves paperwork stops producing it, you know something has gone wrong behind closed doors. I didn't enjoy the silence as much as I thought I would. Silence, in situations like this, is usually preparation. On the third day of that quiet, a certified letter arrived at my door, signature required. This one wasn't from the Aviation Authority. It was from the HOA's legal counsel. The letter was long, carefully worded, and full of phrases designed to sound cooperative while doing absolutely nothing of the sort. It acknowledged a misunderstanding regarding airspace representation. It emphasized that no permanent agreements had been finalized. It suggested that all parties refrain from further action while discussions continued. The part that mattered was near the end. They requested that I refrain from contacting regulatory agencies directly and route all future concerns through HOA counsel. I read that sentence 3 times, then laughed out loud in my kitchen. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the letter to the Aviation Authority contact along with a short note saying I had not agreed to anything and that I had been advised to stop communicating with them. His reply came back faster than any message I'd received from the HOA in years. It consisted of 2 sentences. The first thanked me for the update. The second said they would handle it. That afternoon, Karen broke her silence. She didn't come to my house this time. She went to everyone else's. Neighbors later told me she knocked on doors with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, explaining that outside interference was complicating a promising initiative. She framed it as a misunderstanding caused by excessive reporting. She said regulatory bodies were being overly cautious. She said things would settle if people stayed calm. Someone asked her why the Aviation Authority vehicles had been seen near the HOA office. She said they were there for unrelated matters. Someone else asked why the drone contractor hadn't returned. She said schedules change. Her answers were smooth, but the cracks were starting to show. That evening, the sky filled with the sound she'd been trying to normalize. This time, the drone came closer. It didn't hover over my roof, not directly. It circled nearby, just enough that anyone watching could argue it wasn't targeting me. But it dipped low enough that I could clearly see it, black frame, steady lights, camera gimbal tilting as it adjusted. It made 2 slow passes, then pulled back. I didn't call anyone. I didn't need to. Within 20 minutes, my phone rang. The Aviation Authority representative didn't ask questions this time. He told me they had received multiple reports. He told me the flight had been logged and identified. He told me that the operator had claimed authorization through the HOA. Then he told me that claim was about to become a problem. The next morning, the problem arrived. A white truck with government markings pulled up in front of the HOA office, followed by another and then another. People slowed their cars to stare. Someone filmed from their phone. Doors opened, folders came out, and the atmosphere shifted from suburban routine to something much heavier. By noon, word spread that an enforcement review was underway. The HOA office closed early. The receptionist stopped answering calls. Karen's car was still in the parking lot. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt wary. People who build their authority on confidence alone don't like being exposed, and they rarely accept consequences quietly. Sure enough, just after sunset there was a knock on my door. It wasn't Karen. It was the HOA president. He looked older up close, the kind of tired that comes from realizing you trusted the wrong person too long. He introduced himself like we'd never met, even though his name had been on every letter they'd ever sent me. He said he wanted to talk. He said this had gotten out of hand. He said Karen had been enthusiastic. I asked him if he understood that his association had claimed control over my property to a federal authority. He winced at the word control. He said no one intended to imply ownership. He said Karen had been delegated exploratory authority. He said mistakes happen. I told him mistakes don't usually involve falsified consent and unapproved flights. He asked what it would take to put this behind us. The way he asked made it clear he was hoping for something simple. A retraction. A statement. Silence. I told him it was no longer up to me. His shoulders sagged when I said it. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him he should probably start by telling the truth to whoever was asking questions and stop letting Karen speak for him. He nodded slowly, then left. As I closed the door, I looked up at my roof, still untouched, still mine. Karen had tried to turn it into a bargaining chip, a vertical asset, a piece of imaginary power. Now the weight of actual authority was pressing down on the people who let her do it. And the higher this had gone, the harder the fall was going to be. The fallout didn't come all at once. It crept in through whispers, half-confirmed updates, and the subtle way people avoided eye contact when they passed my house. The HOA office stayed closed for 2 full days, blinds drawn, fountains silent, like the heart of the neighborhood had decided to pretend it wasn't there. Karen's car disappeared from the parking lot sometime during that stretch, and that absence spoke louder than any announcement ever could. On the 3rd morning, an email finally went out to all residents. It was signed by the HOA president, not Karen, and it was written in the careful tone of someone who had been coached sentence by sentence. It said the association was cooperating with an external review. It said certain initiatives had been paused. It said residents should direct all questions to legal counsel. Karen's name appeared once, buried in a line about a former volunteer coordinator. Former was doing a lot of work there. By noon, my phone rang again. This time the Aviation Authority representative didn't bother with pleasantries. He told me the review had escalated from inquiry to enforcement. He said multiple misrepresentations had been identified. He said unauthorized drone operations tied to false claims of consent were taken very seriously. Then he said something that made me sit down. He said the HOA had attempted to retroactively justify control by submitting amended documents that still listed my property. They had tried to fix the lie instead of removing it. I told him I hadn't agreed to anything and never would. He said he knew. He said that was now well documented. He also said the contractor operating the drones had already suspended their relationship with the HOA and was cooperating fully. When I asked what that meant for the association, he paused before answering. He said consequences tend to scale with persistence. That afternoon, Karen reappeared. Not at my door. At the edge of my driveway. I saw her before she said anything, standing there with her arms folded, posture stiff, expression set in a way that felt rehearsed. She didn't cross onto my property this time. That alone told me something had shifted. The confidence was still there, but it was brittle now, like glass under pressure. She said we needed to talk. I told her no, but she talked anyway. She said the situation had spiraled. She said people were overreacting. She said regulators didn't understand community innovation. She said I could have stopped this earlier by being reasonable. She said a lot of things, fast, like if she kept moving forward she wouldn't have to look down. I asked her if she'd submitted amended documents listing my roof again. She didn't answer directly. She said the HOA had a responsibility to correct misunderstandings. She said removing properties too early could complicate reviews. She said legal advised consistency. I told her consistency wasn't the same as truth. Her face tightened. She accused me of enjoying this. She said I liked watching things fall apart. She said I'd turned a simple idea into a federal issue. When I reminded her that she was the one who'd invoked the Aviation Authority in the first place, she snapped that she'd done what she had to do to be taken seriously. That was the first honest thing she'd said. She asked me, finally, what I wanted. The question wasn't an offer. It was a test. She was trying to see if there was a lever she could still pull. I told her I wanted my name off every document, my property removed from every filing, and no further contact from the HOA regarding anything that involved my roof, my airspace, or my silence. I told her the rest was between the HOA and the people who enforce rules in the sky. She stared at me for a long moment, then laughed, sharp and humorless. She said it was too late for that. She said things were already in motion. She said I'd force their hand. I watched her walk back to her car, shoulders rigid, steps too quick. As she drove away, I noticed her brake lights flicker twice before she turned the corner, like hesitation trying to surface and being shut down. That evening, the neighborhood group chat exploded again, but this time it wasn't controlled. Someone posted a photo of enforcement vehicles outside the HOA office. Someone else shared a screenshot of a public notice about suspended operations related to unmanned aerial activity. People started asking questions Karen couldn't answer anymore. She tried anyway. She jumped into the thread with a long message about resilience and misunderstanding, about innovation being punished, about external forces stifling progress. Within minutes, someone replied asking why she'd claimed authority she didn't have. Another asked why she'd used a private home without consent. A third asked why the HOA's insurance provider had sent out a notice earlier that afternoon. Karen stopped responding after that. Late that night, as I was locking up, I heard the familiar hum one last time. A drone, high and distant, passing over the neighborhood without slowing, without circling, without interest in my roof at all. Just a machine following rules, indifferent to human ambition. I looked up and smiled. Karen had wanted the sky so badly she'd forgotten it doesn't belong to people who pretend. And now that the weight of real authority had landed, the ground beneath her plans was starting to give way. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to paperwork. Not the friendly kind with logos and community updates, but the kind that arrives quietly and makes people reread sentences with a knot in their stomach. HOA members received notices about special assessments being postponed. Vendors were informed that contracts were under review. The board announced an emergency meeting, closed session only, no residents allowed. That last part didn't stop people from gathering outside the office anyway, phones out, curiosity buzzing louder than any drone ever had. I stayed home. There's a point in situations like this where being visible stops helping and starts inviting blame. Karen had already tried to make me the obstacle. I wasn't about to give her a stage. Instead, I watched from my window as the HOA president arrived early, shoulders hunched, tie loosened. 2 board members showed up separately, neither speaking to the other. Karen arrived last. She didn't park in her usual spot. She sat in her car for a full minute before getting out, staring straight ahead, hands on the steering wheel like she was bracing for impact. When she finally stepped out, she didn't have the clipboard. She didn't have the smile. She had a folder tucked under her arm and the unmistakable posture of someone who knows the ground is no longer solid beneath them. The meeting lasted 3 hours. I didn't need a transcript to know how it went. People talk. People vent. And when things go wrong at that scale, the truth leaks through cracks faster than anyone can contain it. By early afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors who'd never spoken to me before. They asked what was really happening. They asked if the HOA could actually be fined. They asked if insurance dropping coverage was normal. One message stood out. It was short, sent by someone who lived near the office. Karen was yelling. Apparently, she'd tried to defend herself by saying she'd acted in the community's best interest. She'd said the Aviation Authority overreacted. She'd said the filings were exploratory. When someone asked why my name was listed under consent multiple times, she'd blamed a template. When someone asked why she doubled down after being told to stop, she'd said backing down would have looked weak. That was the moment the room turned on her. Because weakness, it turns out, is much easier to forgive than arrogance that drags everyone else into a mess. By the time the meeting ended, Karen left through a side door. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't speak. She walked fast, head down, and drove away without waiting for the rest of the board. The HOA president came out later, looking like he'd aged a decade. He spoke quietly to one of the enforcement officials who'd been waiting nearby, nodded several times, and handed over a folder. That folder mattered. That evening, I received an email from the HOA's legal counsel again, this one shorter, stripped of its earlier confidence. It formally acknowledged that my property had been listed without authorization. It stated that all references to my address were being withdrawn from any filings, drafts, or communications. It requested confirmation that I had received the notice. I replied with a single sentence confirming receipt. Then I forwarded it to the Aviation Authority. The response I got back wasn't long, but it carried weight. They thanked me for the update. They informed me that enforcement actions were continuing independently. They reminded me to report any further activity. They closed by saying my cooperation had been appreciated. Cooperation, not compliance. The difference mattered. The real shift came 2 days later. A public notice appeared on the HOA website, visible to anyone who bothered to look. It announced that Karen was no longer acting in any official or volunteer capacity. It didn't explain why. It didn't apologize. It didn't mention airspace, drones, or authority. But everyone knew. The neighborhood group chat reacted instantly. Some people expressed shock. Others said they'd seen it coming. A few tried to defend her, saying she'd meant well. Those voices were quieter now, drowned out by the growing realization that her confidence had nearly cost the entire association a fortune. That afternoon, I saw Karen one last time. She was loading boxes into her car in front of her house, movements sharp and irritated. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. As she slammed the trunk shut, she looked up and noticed me watching from my porch. For a moment, there was something raw on her face. Not anger. Not even defiance. Fear. Fear of what comes after the performance ends and reality finally catches up. She got into her car and drove away without a word. As the sun set, the sky above my roof remained empty, quiet, exactly as it should have been. The HOA had lost control of the narrative. Karen had lost control of the lie. And the authority she'd tried to wield like a prop had turned out to be very real, very heavy, and completely uninterested in excuses. The story wasn't finished yet. Enforcement doesn't rush, and consequences rarely arrive all at once. But the direction was clear now. She had tried to lease the sky. And the sky had answered back. The waiting was the hardest part, because by then there was nothing left to argue about, only consequences moving through systems too large to care about anyone's intentions. The HOA office reopened with reduced hours, the fountain came back on like nothing had happened, and the neighborhood tried to settle back into routine. But routine felt fragile now, like everyone was aware that the illusion of control could crack at any moment. I thought it was over. Or at least that my part in it was. Then the letter arrived. This one wasn't from the HOA, and it wasn't from the Aviation Authority either. It was from the association's insurance provider, addressed to me by name, and it referenced the incident in language that made my eyebrows climb. They were conducting a liability review. They wanted a statement confirming that I had not authorized any use of my property or airspace, and that I had not received any compensation or benefit from the attempted lease. In other words, they were checking to make sure I wasn't part of the problem. I gave them exactly what they asked for, nothing more. Clear dates, clear denials, copies of correspondence. When I sent it off, I felt that familiar sense of stepping aside while something larger rolled forward. Insurance companies don't do reviews for entertainment. They do them to decide who's about to pay. The answer came faster than I expected. 2 days later, a notice went out to HOA members informing them that the association's insurance coverage would not extend to any claims arising from unauthorized aerial activity or misrepresentation of property control. It was written in dense legal language, but the meaning was simple enough that even the group chat understood it. If fines were coming, the HOA was on its own. That night, the emergency meeting resumed, this time with homeowners allowed to attend. I didn't go. I didn't need to hear the arguments, the justifications, the attempts to rewrite history. The messages I got afterward told me everything. Voices raised. Accusations flying. Someone asking how this had been allowed to happen. Someone else asking why warnings had been ignored. Karen's name came up a lot. But so did the board's. Blame, it turns out, is contagious. The real confirmation came the following week, delivered quietly, without drama. A public enforcement summary was posted by the Aviation Authority, outlining violations related to unauthorized drone operations and false claims of airspace control within a residential area. It didn't name individuals, but it named the association. It listed penalties. It listed corrective actions. It listed a compliance timeline. I read it twice, slowly. Karen hadn't just been wrong. She dragged the entire HOA into a regulated world that doesn't care about enthusiasm or intent. The fines were substantial enough that people started doing math in public. Assessments were discussed. Lawsuits were mentioned. Suddenly, everyone understood what vertical utilization really meant. It meant gravity. A few days later, I received one final call from the Aviation Authority. The representative thanked me again, said the matter was nearing resolution, and told me there would be no further action required on my part. Before hanging up, he added something almost casually. He said cases like this often start small. He said they escalate when someone refuses to accept boundaries. He said most people learn before it reaches enforcement. Most people. That evening, I walked the neighborhood for the first time in weeks. People nodded. A few apologized, awkwardly. One neighbor admitted they'd believed Karen because she sounded so sure of herself. Another said they'd assumed the HOA wouldn't risk something that big without permission. Assumptions, I'd learned, are powerful things. As I turned back toward my house, I saw a moving truck parked 2 streets over, Karen's old address printed on the mailbox in the foreground. I didn't know where she was going, and I didn't care. Her story here was finished, whether she accepted that or not. When I got home, I stood in my driveway and looked up one last time. No drones. No markers. No imaginary leases written in the clouds. Just open sky, governed by rules that don't bend for confidence or convenience. There was one chapter left to this mess, and it wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about accountability. And accountability, unlike authority, doesn't need to pretend. The final consequence didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It arrived the way real endings usually do, quietly, in writing, impossible to argue with once it existed. I found out on a Tuesday morning, through a public posting buried on a government website that most people never check unless they're looking for trouble or closure. The Aviation Authority had closed the case. Not dismissed it. Closed it. The summary was clinical, precise, and devastating in its simplicity. Unauthorized representation of airspace control. False consent documentation. Unapproved unmanned operations. Failure to cease after notice. Penalties assessed. Compliance orders issued. And then the line that made me sit back in my chair. Permanent prohibition against the association engaging in or facilitating any aerial, rooftop, or vertical utilization agreements without direct federal approval and individual property owner consent. Karen hadn't just lost. She'd poisoned the well so thoroughly that no one else could even approach it. The HOA sent one last email that afternoon. It was shorter than any before it, stripped of ambition, stripped of spin. It acknowledged the enforcement outcome. It confirmed that fines would be paid from reserve. It warned of possible future assessments. It stated that new internal controls would be implemented. It did not mention innovation. It did not mention drones. It did not mention the sky. It also did not mention Karen. People reacted in stages. First came disbelief, then anger, then the slow settling of reality as spreadsheets circulated and numbers became unavoidable. Some residents were furious at Karen. Others were furious at the board. A few were furious at me, quietly, the way people get angry at the messenger when they don't like the message. None of it touched me. My roof was still mine. My name was clean. And every authority that mattered had it on record that I'd said no from the beginning. A week later, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. This one was different from all the others. No threats, no requests, just a formal apology written by counsel, acknowledging that my property had been improperly referenced and that no future claims would be made. Enclosed was a document stating, in unmistakable language, that the HOA waived any present or future interest in my roof, airspace, or related rights. They had to send it. The enforcement order required it. I signed nothing. I filed it away. The neighborhood slowly moved on. New topics replaced old arguments. The fountain ran again. Committees reorganized. Someone suggested repainting the clubhouse. Life resumed, but it never quite went back to the way it had been. There was a new caution in the air, an unspoken understanding that confidence doesn't equal authority, and pretending otherwise can be expensive. I never saw Karen again. I heard things, of course, that she'd tried to frame it as a misunderstanding elsewhere, that she'd complained about being scapegoated, that she still insisted she'd been right in principle. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she needed to. People who build themselves on imagined power don't collapse gracefully. But the truth didn't need her agreement. One evening, months later, I stood on my porch as a delivery drone passed far overhead, well within a regulated corridor, invisible to most people, irrelevant to my life. It didn't slow. It didn't look down. It didn't care who lived below. That was the irony she'd never understood. The sky doesn't negotiate. It doesn't belong to confidence, committees, or clipboards. It belongs to rules written in hard lessons and enforced without emotion. You can't lease it by acting official. You can't control it by sounding certain. And you definitely can't bully your way into it with laminated authority. Karen had tried to turn my roof into a shortcut to power. She'd tried to rent something she didn't own, thinking momentum would carry her through. Instead, momentum carried her straight into a system that doesn't blink. In the end, nothing dramatic happened to me. No victory speech. No public vindication. Just a quiet return to normal, with one important difference. Everyone learned where the real boundaries were. And every time I look up at my roof, unchanged and unclaimed, I'm reminded that some spaces don't belong to the loudest voice in the room. They belong to the people who know when to say no and let gravity do the rest.